Hello, welcome back to the Robert E. Howard Foundation channel. Today we will do our channel's first official month-long Robert E. Howard event. We have designated October to be the month for a horrific Howard Halloween. For the last several decades, Bob Howard was primarily known for two things as a writer: sword and sorcery or heroic fantasy, with Conan leading his characters in this genre, and then his goodness, I can't even speak this morning, and his horror stories, primarily published in Weird Tales. This month, we will be looking at some of Bob's horror stories. Today, our panel will be discussing five of Bob's horror stories for their importance. And, I know I'm going to say horror. I just get that out of the way now. So today, our panel will be discussing five of Bob's horror stories for their importance in his career and in the horror genre. Joining us on the panel we're all returning, are Bob Byrne, Bobby Derie, John C. Hocking, Dr. Patrice Louinet, and Michael K. Vaughan. Okay, gentlemen, let's dive into the Robert E. Howard's world of horror. The first two stories we're going to discuss are important because they were his second and third stories that were published in The Forest of Villefere and Wolfshead. So first off, Patrice, is that the proper pronunciation of the word Villefere? Can't hear you.
Villefere.
Villefere, okay.
Villefere. The R is not rounded.
Oh,
Villefere.
okay. Oh,
But you
Villefere.
call me Patrice, so there's no way you can, make this work. You would have to call me Patrice, and then it would be okay.
Patrice, huh?
But I survive.
Okay. um, in the Forest of Villefere appeared in 1925, so this is the centennial anniversary year for that publication. And then Wolfshead, the sequel, appeared the next year in Weird Tales. Um, what do we think about In the Forest of Villefere? It's a fairly short story that he wrote. Not too much involved with it, although he did take an interesting turn on the werewolf legend at that point. Uh, for that story, he had the werewolf turning into a man, or the wolf turning into a man. And in Wolfshead, he would explain that a little bit more. But what do y'all think of Villefere? Lord, Patrice. Villefere.
I think it's a nice little story. Uh, I mean, if it was the only thing he had written, it wouldn't be remembered today. I mean, it's just nice, but I think it's as good as the early August Derleth stories. I don't know if that's a compliment, though.
To an extent, fits into Weird Tales in its era. But you're right, it's a simple story with a direct and violent conclusion. I think it's probably most interesting in how it connects to the next story we're going to be talking about, Wolf's Head. So,
Yeah, yeah.
It,
One thing to be said about early Weird Tales, especially if you have read those early issues of the magazine, because readers today would only be familiar with H.P. Lovecraft. But if you decide one day to read all those early issues, which I have, it's a chore. I mean, it's lots of. I mean, I guess Bobby, you must have read a lot. If I know you, I think I do. Most of them are boring. There's nothing worthwhile in Weird Tales. The first 3, 4, 5 years are just painful. Mostly, there
yeah,
are obviously a few exceptions, but mostly is yeah, boring.
and that's important. That's really important when you're looking at Robert Howard's early horror stories is to understand the context. Because before he found his own rhythm, he was really going into that late 19th century vibe of horror that was like Ambrose Bierce and a little bit of Edgar Allan Poe, but with a more adventurous twist because that was what Howard did. But you read some of these stories, especially the early ones, and it's like it's that can such things be? It's very much not what we would normally think of as a Robert E. Howard horror story per se. It's just generic, not usually a ghost story, but just generic stuff. Um, but he was going with what was popular because Weird Tales had a surprising number of werewolf stories in the early run. under Wright at least. They had a lot of werewolf stories. It was like the second most popular monster right after vampires. And there was no werewolf lore at this point because the Wolfman hadn't come out. So you were all going off of Montague Summers and what he was writing about werewolves and adapting it like that. So Howard's work in The Forest of Villefere, it's a fine little story. It's not great. It is most interesting today for what it led to.
I was going to say that, do you think, Patrice, did he write it before The Werewolf of Ponkert came out, or? Okay.
Before it came out for sure, because no, wait 1 second. Werewolf of Ponkert came out at the exact same time, the exact same issue that the Villefere was published, and we'll talk about Ponkert when we talk about Wolfshead, obviously.
I thought
I don't know when. Yeah, Ponkert was written. Bobby, correct me if I'm wrong. If memory serves, Ponkert was written after H. Walter Munn had read a comment by Lovecraft in Weird Tales, and that was in 1923, 1924. I'm a bit hazy on that thing. And Lovecraft was lamenting about the lack of original werewolf stories, and that was what led Munn to write The Werewolf of Ponkert. But I do not know when he wrote the tale. Villefere was written we don't have any precise date, early 1925, but I cannot be any more precise than that.
Yeah, I think you just mistakenly said the Ponkert came out the same issue as Villefere, but it actually came out the issue with Spear and Fang.
Yeah, it was July 1925.
Spear and Fang, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the funny thing about that is Munn had completely misunderstood what Lovecraft had gone on about. Lovecraft had said, nobody has ever written a werewolf story from the perspective of the werewolf as somebody that enjoys being a wolf. And instead, Munn wrote this mopey guy that doesn't want to be a monster, but he is. So he completely missed the point. But it was extremely popular at Weird Tales and with the editors. There was a whole series of Werewolf upon Kurt tales. But no, I don't think that Howard had read that before he wrote his werewolf tales at all.
Well, yeah, because I guess probably getting more into Wolfshead, but when he goes into the lore a little bit more, but I do think there might have been some influence, especially in writing Wolfshead, from the Werewolf of Ponkert, because in Wolfshead,
more than that, Wolfshead was born out of the Wolf of Ponkert. There's no question about that.
Because I guess we can probably move on into talking about Wolfshead too.
Hang on 1 sec though. On still on Villefere. I can't even say that word. Very good.
It's okay. It's okay.
It's changed a little over time. You know how in TV shows there's still sometimes they're like 15 minutes now, but there was that little 2-minute, 3-minute intro, and then you went to the credits or a TV commercial, and then the rest of the episode. That's how I feel in The Forest is when I read it. It's that little intro you get, and then you go to Wolfshead. I mean, it really had that effect on me when I was reading them back to back for this. That it's almost like a prologue to Wolfshead as opposed to an entire separate story. And for me,
yeah, it's cool to see Howard's imagination sort of piling one thing on top of another as you follow Dumontour from one sort of into the next story. You can sort of see Howard's imagination, building on itself. It's cool.
Yeah, Michael?
And that is the way to read them these days is Villefere, then Wolfshead. Yeah.
Michael, do you want to say something?
Oh, I just mentioned that now that's the way it is. Villefere is an intro to Wolfshead, but that's just because, of the way it's turned out and the way we read it now. It'd be weird to read Wolfshead without Villefere because they are so connected. And I do think as just a nice, in The Forest of Villefere, it's just a nice little Weird Tales story that does fit very much into what the magazine was publishing at the time, but certainly, as has been mentioned, in quality, a bit better, for sure. And it's a nice, good little story, all on its own. But certainly Wolfshead is something else entirely.
Yeah.
I was going to say that one of the interesting things is that with these two stories, Villefere and Wolfshead, that it seems like Howard revisited them when he rewrote his first Solomon Kane story, Red Shadows, because you have the name of the monster in Villefere, it's Carolus Lalou, and then you also have the villain in Red Shadows is Lalou, and that ending up on the coast of Africa where Kane chases Lalou to Africa. But
this is becoming a French podcast.
Yeah. We want to make you welcome, Patrice. So, or is it Patrice? Let's see. So in Villefere, Howard has I guess, the legend from the women in the village stating that if you come upon a werewolf, if you kill it when it's in wolf form, you're fine. But when you kill it when it's in man form, that the ghost of the wolf will haunt you and turn you into a werewolf from that point on. So that's very different from, the legends of werewolf up to that point for the previous, I guess at that time, 2,500 years, where it's usually men turning into wolves. So that I thought was a quite interesting flipping of the story by Howard on that point, at least. So moving on to Wolfshead, starts out with the narrator of the story telling about going to Dom Vincente's castle there at the coast of Africa. I believe Dom Vincente was Portuguese, right? And
yeah.
that he has an annual party, weeks long party that he has for guests there. And so one of the people that shows up is the Montour, the werewolf. He then proceeds to talk about all the various people that are at the party: Don Vincente, his nephew Carlos, his niece Isabel, and then Luigi Veranza and his sister Marchita, and Von Schilling, and I forget the other person there, that are all, I guess, talking Star Trek lore would be red shirts. So what do y'all think about Wolfshead going from there?
I was a little surprised to find those first couple stories here were both first person. Maybe it's because I hadn't read them in such a long time. I tend to think of Howard's first person stuff as being humorous, so I could get pulled right into Wolfshead. The reader in Wolfshead, the reader's like addressed as though he's part of a group, as though you're there like in the room with the narrator and he's talking to you, as opposed to just like laying down a story on the page. Which is this is cool. This is Howard exploring different ways to tell a story, I thought. So it starts off kind of heavy, doesn't it? It's like the word fear appears 6 times in the first paragraph. So it takes him a little while to sort of get himself rolling. It's like I'm telling a horror story now and it's scary. It's fear. There's a lot of fear going on. By the end, I think he's really caught his balance, and this is one of Howard's best early stories, I think.
Well, he sets up a siege mentality right away, because you have this group of white people in a European castle and an African coast, and they're, slave traders and all that. So there is very much that antebellum plantation era siege mentality, which underwrites the whole story. And I said before, I don't think the Werewolf of Ponkert influence in the Forest of Villefere, but you can definitely see it here in how Montfort feels as a werewolf.
I like the siege mentality part, because this story to me, I was immediately started thinking of and the reason's a little different, but Black Stranger and Beyond the Black River, this idea of carving out whatever the settlement, whether it's a trading empire or he fled, and created a castle, or breaking into the savage lands. Just this setup of this small, and it's clearly under siege at all 3 of the stories with the Picts and the natives, and I like that theme, and it's more an underlying of that civilization barbarism thing, because I don't think that's really at all really what Howard's after at this time or in that story. But I saw that common element through all 3 of those, and there's probably more. I didn't think of Kane, but I like that theme of carving it out, And then there's always this menace in all three of those, whatever that menace was, against whoever the protagonist may be, or the party that's established the outpost, as it were.
I think it's difficult. Go ahead.
It has a very good sense of place, this story, where you have, you know, this teensy bit of civilization at the edge of a barbarous world, and how they are in danger of being overwhelmed, and it just has that nice sense of place. And I really like this particular monster, you know, this particular version of the werewolf, where Howard kind of writes his own rules a little bit about this demonic kind of possessing creature. It's interesting. I think the story itself on its own is a pretty good story. Some of the characters are a little over the top, but the story itself, I think, is really, really solid. And I think it works quite well as a horror story, and sensational as a story in Weird Tales, you know.
Yeah, I think it has some of the same structure we'll see in later tales, such as Red Shadows or Red Nails, in which you take people and you put them in an environment that is not theirs usually. So here it is Africa, which is absolutely not realistic at any moment in the story. And what you have there in this story, for me, what was very interesting is the introduction of sexuality in Bob's writing. This tale oozes sex all the time. We have Marcita and Isabel, and one is a minx, the other one is shy and demure or something. You have this thing about the werewolf, which I think is very interesting, because when you read the story, the werewolf kills the man when the natives, but when he sees a young woman, he does not kill her. So he's clearly lusting after women. And what is the werewolf if not a guy that can be a friend during the day and a threat at night? And that's the whole problem of the thing. We have Marcita, she welcomes, I mean, she invites the vampire to a bedroom, and then she gets more than what she bargained for. So there is this constant tension of sex and sexuality during the whole tale, which for me makes it very interesting. It's a study in duality, if you think about it. You have Marcita and Isabel, you have de Montour, he's a vampire and a human being. Everyone has his doppelganger.
Going to say that the influences from Munn's Werewolf of Ponkert, and would you also possibly think maybe even a little bit of Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos, with Howard stating that the beginning of the world, our Earth was visited by various, I guess, demons, spirits from the space that came down to our world, and they inhabited the various animals as well as man. Man had the good, some of the animals had the bad. Man was able to go and kill off the bad spirits and the bad animals, except for the wolves, and that the demons and the wolves then would turn them into werewolves, where they would become man form. And so, as he further explained, his theory would be that if you kill the wolf when it's still in its wolf shape, then it's okay. But when it's in the man shape, then you kill it, then the demons release it, it haunts you and turns you into a werewolf at that point. What do y'all think about that idea?
I think that's more of a theosophical idea. The whole spirits coming down out of the outer dark and possessing animals. There's a weird legacy to that, though, because while it didn't get picked up very much in the pulp fiction, it got picked up by comic books. Don Glut used almost the exactly same story when he was writing, I think it was Dagar the Invincible, his sword and sorcery series for Dell. But yeah, it's just, demons possess wolves and become the first werewolves, and it goes on down the line. But now I wouldn't say that's a Lovecraftian influence, but it's definitely Robert E. Howard doing something different. And it works. It's internally consistent with its own logic. And it's kind of interesting because when you get to the end where de Montfort is struggling with the possession, he's swimming across the crocodile-infested river, and that courage overcoming the supernatural is very much a Robert E. Howard moment.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I think that really goes into some of the Solomon Kane stories.
And can I ask a question really quickly, because I haven't read Werewolf of Ponkert since I think I was 15, so it's been a while. So what elements of that story, the Werewolf of Ponkert, did Robert E. Howard use, or where was the influence on his story?
Well, the story came out, as we said, the exact same month that Villefere, Spirit Thing was published. So that was a month prior. And the first Ponkert story is about a werewolf. It's a first-person narrative, and the narrator is named Pierre. So that's a lot. I guess it was it would be the spur that led Bob to write Wolfshead. It's not inspired in any way, but sure, you find the same framework, the same narrator, same first-person narrative, and from that, Bob wrote his own story.
I was going to say, I read The Werewolf of Ponkert in preparation for this, and actually he has the same animals, what's actually an evil spirit coming from outer space down to Earth and becoming, I believe it was the master. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, Bobby.
Yeah,
the master creates his own werewolves to run with him in his pack. And I guess I want to say Vladislav was the main person, I think, for that. Gets turned into a werewolf by the master because he killed one of the werewolves as they were attacking him. And, the first story is his revenge on the master. And then several stories after that where various members of his descendants are going after the master to try and kill the master as werewolves, which I haven't read. I'm assuming you have read them all, Bobby?
Yeah. Some of the later ones are hard to get, but yeah.
Okay.
They're not good. The last ones are not good. The first one holds up quite well. Yeah. And also, we know that Bob was a fan of Munn, so he wrote to Lovecraft.
Yeah.
And I thought it would be interesting to go into the history of the writing of Wolfshead, because Howard did write Wolfshead, did send it in. It was accepted by Farnsworth Wright, and it was going to become the cover story. So they sent the copy of the story to the artist to do the cover. The artist loses the story. So Farnsworth Wright writes a letter to Howard stating, "Can you send us one of your carbon copies of the story so that we can get it fixed?" And Howard was like, "What's a carbon copy?"
What a horror story that is.
And quickly rewrote the story from memory in 1 or 2 days.
Patrice. Yeah. 2 days.
Sent it back in. And from that point on, he started using carbon paper for writing his stories. So I thought that was very interesting.
Save. That was his version of that back in that time, was make sure you hit save repeatedly.
Yeah.
But then we also have Howard wrote a parody in one of his letters to his friend Clyde Smith of Wolfshead called Wolfsdung, where he makes fun of Wolfshead. And Wolfsdung is included in the Collected Letters of Robert E. Howard, Volume 1. And he basically just turns it into a farce using slang and everything. And the Montour his affliction is not as a werewolf, but as, a human wolf, ha-cha-cha-cha, hey baby, where he's running around ripping the pants off of people. So what did y'all think of Wolfsdung?
You couldn't really recommend it to someone who wasn't already well and truly into Howard, I don't think, but there's a few moments of really tasty absurdity in there. So one sentence just stopped me in my tracks. It's like, it was a peculiarity about the Vincenti Castle that when there was a crowd there, almost invariably several people would be present, which is just about as silly of a thing as you could possibly say. So, yeah, it still cracked me up, and I'd read it a couple times.
I like the line where he said, let's see, they were sitting down for dinner. He said, "A strange man, de Montour, he kept his hands out of sight under the table most of the time. The girl sitting next to him must have been joking about him, for they kept starting and squealing every now and then."
I told you it was a tale about sex.
Yeah.
Kind of felt like a National Lampoon or a Harvard Lampoon version of the story.
Yeah, what do you suppose Howard would think about us like actually discussing this casual thing he wrote in a letter to a friend? I mean,
I would
I don't
imagine
think
he
he
would
ever.
probably not be too happy, but then again, he would think, well, they're talking about me.
Yeah,
So,
and he never. I don't imagine he ever could have expected this level of attention.
yeah, it's like they always say,
Well,
don't keep your letters, or don't write anything in your letters if you expect to be semi-famous or famous at some point that you wouldn't want your mother to be able to read later on. So, we have anything else to talk about, Villefere or Wolfshead? Oh, I thought that was also one thing, because you always wonder, why is it named Wolfshead? But apparently the demon's ghost is the head of a wolf that keeps appearing. So that was a nice touch on his part.
One
I'll add
thing,
just one thing, sorry, about the racial elements in Wolfshead. Howard didn't know anything about Africa at this point. It was all the dark continent, jungles. He knew slaves came from there, but he didn't know anything about the actual peoples that lived there. But what little he did pick up from the pulps, he tries to cram into his story. So there's a reference early on to the leopard societies, which is an interesting thing, because here is this sort of human African equivalent to a werewolf that was very big in the pulps at the time, that he throws in there as a sort of red herring. And it doesn't last very long, but that sort of goes to show how Howard would incorporate these elements that he felt were correct for the purposes of the story. The actual characterization of the black people in the story, not great, especially that slave character that, just becomes enamored with the white guy's hair. That's, it's not politically correct, and it wasn't meant to be. At the time, that's just how it was.
I was also wondering, because potentially with his love of Edgar Rice Burroughs, maybe, I don't know whether he had written, Burroughs had written Tarzan and the Leopard Men yet.
yeah, I was just about to ask that. I don't know when that one appeared.
How about you, Michael? You're our big Burroughs fan.
I can't remember. I was just thinking that as well, Tarzan and the Leopard Man, but I can't remember off the top of my head what year that was written. Certainly, if it had been written, he had read it.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure when it was published. I can't remember off the top of my head.
Yeah. Oh, one other thing that Jogging talking about his depiction of Africa.
Sorry, August of 32 to January of 33 is when that appeared.
Okay.
Yeah, so way later.
Much later, yeah.
I'm reminded of when Howard wrote the first Solomon King story that became Red Shadows, that he had sent it into Argosy to be published there, and he received that nice 4-page handwritten letter back from one of the assistant editors of Argosy, telling him, "Hey, you've really got the stuff. Let me tell you some of the things we find wrong with this story." And that editor said, "And was it Eugene O'Neill depiction of what's going on in the African jungles at that time really needs to change. Either keep it specific to the time period that you're going to, or don't write it in a modern way." So I found that interesting.
Yeah, Eugene O'Neill was a playwright that did primarily African American subjects. Like, he was a white guy, but it was primarily black subjects, and a lot of social commentary about mixed race relationships. And it doesn't all read very well today, but at the time it was considered fairly progressive.
All right.
I guess one last thing. This is just me noticing what probably seems obvious to most anyone who's read much Carl Edward Wagner. If you've read if you've read Death Angel Shadow, if you've read Reflections on the Winner of My Soul,
yeah,
Wolfshead has direct influence on that. Which, we're all trapped in a castle, and there's a werewolf in here. We don't know which one of it is. This is that basic plot element. Wagner does very different things with it. But for whatever reason, I've read both of these stories. I don't know how many times. I never saw the direct influence on Wagner by Wolfshead. Both great stories. Wouldn't want to be without either of them.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, I was talking to somebody else and telling him about it. He said, "Oh, you're going to talk about Carl Edward Wagner's Winter Reflections of My Soul." And I said, "Oh yeah, good point. Yeah."
Oh, yeah, sure.
Anything else? All right, let's move on to the Black Stone. This story was printed in 1931, and definitely after Howard had been reading and corresponding with H.P. Lovecraft, and this is considered to be one of the best stories of the Cthulhu mythos not written by Lovecraft. What do you guys think about the Black Stone?
This was very much Howard trying something new. And, if you look at Howard's stories, there are like three very rough categories for his horror fiction. Like the very early stuff is, as I said, very much based on that late 19th century Ambrose Bierce style. What things are these? And then if you look at the very short period from like 1930 to 1932 or 3, there's the Lovecraft stories where he's trying to do Lovecraft not as a pastiche, but to use those elements and approach stories from that almost archaeological and anthropological horror angle. And then after that, you've got him having fully absorbed the Lovecraft influence and the ghost story influence, and he's trying to say it in his own words, in his own settings, and that's when you get all the weird westerns and stuff. And that's a very broad, rough thing because I'm not talking about a lot of stuff, but this is right there in the middle of the Lovecraft period where he's like, okay, how can I write a story that uses that Lovecraftian approach but make it mine? And that's what it is.
I think there's more than that. Most people read this story as a kind of Lovecraft pastiche or Howard trying to emulate. Oh, there's a part of it for sure. But for me, and for reasons way too complex to evoke here, is actually telling a story to Lovecraft. Sorry, I mean, it's long and complex, so I cannot go into that at the moment. People focus on the Lovecraft influence, but if the basic framework of the story is borrowed not from Lovecraft, but from Nathaniel Hawthorne. I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with Young and Brown. Oh, the
Young
title
Goodman
escapes me.
Brown.
Yeah, it's the exact same thing. Is this guy who is I haven't read that in a while. He's in the village and he follows someone in the forest and it looks like him. And then you rise in the middle of the woods and there's this Sabbath going on. It's the coven. And then you realize there's something else. And then he has to go back and his whole sense of reality has been shattered, which is the basic framework of the Black Stone. He got the word, Howard uses the word coven in the Black Stone. That's the only time in his whole career that he used that word. And he got it from Lovecraft in a letter that HPL sent him in October. And I need to read because I cannot remember exactly. Okay. And I would suggest you read a story that was published in Weird Tale for February 1928. It's called The Shadow on the Moor, written by a guy named Stuart Strauss, which tells a story of a guy who finds himself in a tavern near a haunted place, and there are sacrifices going on. People go mad. It's the obvious direct source for the Black Stone.
Interesting. I definitely remember Howard and Lovecraft when they were talking about the witch covens of Pennsylvania in their letters. And, I thought one of the things that struck me, if I can just read this off, was the letter that Howard wrote. Let me see here. I'll pull it up. And November 1930 said, "The witch cult offers great possibilities in itself, and a writer need not tie himself down to the actual limits of the thing. Why should the cult be merely a fertility worship? Why should it not have deeper, darker significance dating from pre-human memories, in fiction at least? And seems like he took that to write The Black Stone, because, you know, they are apparently having not quite a fertility rite at the worship in front of the monolith, more of a sacrificing to, I guess it's supposed to be Sathagwa.
It's pretty much a fertility rite. I mean, you've got this naked woman being flagellated while worshiping a great big black phallic object. I think it is supposed to be a fertility rite. As far as the whole witch cult thing goes, people might not be familiar. In the 1920s, Margaret Alice Murray, who is a very famous Egyptologist, wrote The Witch Cult in Western Europe, which gave her theory that all these witch trials that they had in Europe back in the day were actually persecuting a surviving pagan religion that was basically a fertility cult. And that was an incredibly popular, influential hypothesis, which has since been proven completely wrong because Murray misread and misinterpreted and misrepresented all of the trial records she was going through. But it was extremely influential. So if you look at this story, The Black Stone versus like Lovecraft's The Festival, those are supposed to be interpretations of the same cult. And that's very much what they were talking about in their letters, although Howard never read Murray directly, so he was getting it filtered through Lovecraft.
It was also trying this tale, you know, to infuse some of the other writers' stuff in the story. You know, the village in the Blackstone is called Strigoi Kavar. Sorry for my accent; I don't speak Hungarian, and that comes from Bram Stoker and Dracula.
Yeah,
because you have that in Dracula, it's called Strigoi, and Strigoi is a witch.
Yeah.
And we have plenty of words who actually are similar to Strigoi, as a Strige in French, and there are probably some in English as well. The interesting thing about this Strigoi Kavar thing is it does not appear in the first draft of the story. In the first draft, the village is called Broekerhas. And then he decided at some point to change that to Strigoi Kavar. And the idea for me was, okay, that's a nod to Bram Stoker. So look, I am this land writer doing exactly what Lovecraft was doing, you know, adding references, literary references to his stories. He was really trying to do something with the Black Stone, and not necessarily aping Lovecraft, but telling people that he could also be writing stories in a similar vein, but entirely his own.
Yeah. But now, of course, it has become a Cthulhu mythos story, and I think that's how people consider it. Lovecraft, of course, I think his influence on this story is obvious. Those are the obvious influences that you can see. But as you mentioned, it looks like there's a lot of influences that went into this story in his telling of the story. I would not have thought Hawthorne, but I can see it now that you've mentioned. I've seen Hawthorne in other places in Howard's work, but it's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting to see it in this story, which I had not considered. So that's really interesting. The story itself has Howard's power and Howard's storytelling, and that's what makes the story good. It's just, this is very much a Robert E. Howard horror story to me, despite it being put into the Cthulhu's mythos category, which I think is the way most people think of this story now.
There's a lost sequel to this story. R.H. Barlow, who was a fan at the time and a correspondent of Lovecraft and Howard, had decided to take what Howard had written about nameless cults and turn it into a little history, like the history of the Necronomicon. He wrote it up, and it's gone. We have no idea what happened to it. So just lost little sequel to the story there that vanished into the ether. But
I thought, because I remember the one of the first few letters that he was writing to Lovecraft, and he asked Lovecraft, can you tell me where you're getting all this information on Cthulhu and the Necronomicon, sort of stuff. And Lovecraft said, they're all made up. So.
And that was very typical for Lovecraft. He'd get a lot of people writing in, asking him about more information, and Lovecraft would always admit, well, no, I just made it up for the stories. But that's what encouraged people like Robert E. Howard to make stuff up too, to add to it. So like Jeffrey Joffrey, or I just screwed up his name, Justin Joffrey, the mad poet that Howard comes up with for this story, would reappear in a few other little instances, including one fragment that was later completed by August Derleth, The House in the Oaks. And that was how the mythos got built, was, this guy would create his mad poet and his book and his monster, and then the next guy would make his book and his mad poet and his monster, and they'd make references to each other, and that's how the mythos built during that first period of expansion. And Howard was more inclined to go for the theme of the thing than just, mentioning famous names. You look at his later horror fiction, and he's not just throwing the Necronomicon in there all the damn time. He does it in a couple stories, but it's mostly just those couple in the early 30s. The biggest difference between a Howard mythos story, in this case, and a Lovecraft mythos story is the graphic flagellation scene, which was very much an effort to get a Margaret Brundage cover, because at the time it wasn't seen as obscene to have a flagellation scene, but you could have a naked or near naked woman getting whipped on the cover of Weird Tales, and that would be more okay than if it was just like a romance pulp or something to have a naked woman on there. It was seen as a psychological study rather than something sexy, at least as far as the law was concerned. So that's why Howard would put him in there. And that's why Seabury Quinn would put him in there. There were many Weird Tales writers that they weren't just a bunch of perverts. They were putting this stuff in there because they wanted the cover.
Well, to be fair, some of them could have been perverts. You never know.
Yeah.
So did you guys know that Derleth put Von Yuntz in a Solar Pond story?
Yeah. The Adventure of the Six Silver Spiders.
There you go. Man, I can't get anything past you. You killed me. But you guys know that I'm more Ponds Derleth than horror Derleth. And Six Silver Spiders, there's a auction, a fake auction, but an auction set up of some books, and it includes the copy of the Necronomicon, and Von Yuntz's Nameless Cults, and a couple other ones. But so Derleth tossed in a little Cthulhu mythos from Howard into 1950, I think it was, Solar Pond story.
Yeah, Derleth was involved in the German title for Nameless Cults.
Yeah.
And that's too long to go into here, but the basic thing is, because Von Yuntz is German, Lovecraft thought that the Black Book should have a German name. So he asked August Derleth and E. Hoffman Price, who both gave their own ideas, and what eventually came out was a Nostracklichen Kulten, which is terrible German, but C.C. Senf, who was an artist for Weird Tales, was talking to Farnsworth Wright, the editor of Weird Tales, and he said, that sounds the best, let's go with that one. So they did. There's a big back and forth in the letters about the name of Howard's book in German, and the funny thing is he rarely uses it. I don't think he uses it almost at all.
He used it once.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is, when I grew up, I thought it was the normal phrase in English, because I had a fanzine back then, and that's the title I gave to my fanzine, Unausprechlichen Kulten. And turns out that there was that, because in America it had only been used once.
Yeah.
And Tom Kovacs, I don't know if any of you guys know Tom Kovacs. He was one of the 9 guys that went to Cross Plains in 1996 So he was not German, but he's from Switzerland. And he told me that the correct German for unaussprechlichen Kulten is unaussprechliche Kulten. So it's not that far off.
Yeah.
Interesting. I thought that it was a good adding to the story where Howard starts bringing in a little bit of what the original inhabitants of Strigoi were, or what they looked like, where he's kind of tying them in a little bit to what the Picts were at the time of Bron Mak Morn and later, and then also I guess, sort of the worms of the earth type people.
Yeah, that's at the time he had all those ideas about the Picts, and he had them for years. And then slowly he's starting dividing. There's this vision. There's the Picts on one side, and those are human beings. And there's the little people, the children of the night, and those are reptilian or devolved, using the terminology of the time, devolved human beings that become snake-like as the years and the generations go by. And so you see them all those stories were written in the same time frame, Children of the Night and the Blackstone, and you see the division happening as you read the stories.
Yeah, and that's part of the Lovecraft influence, because Lovecraft had read more of Machen and he'd read more of Murray, and he'd come up with this own idea himself about the little people that were supposed to be part of and behind the witch cult. And Howard took that and he adapted it in his own way and ran with it. Because if you look at the very early Pictish stories where he's talking about more monstrous Picts as monstrous dwarfs versus Picts as these small brown Mediterranean people, those are the earliest stories, And then after he talks to Lovecraft, you start getting stories like the Children of the Night and the People of the Dark, where there's this sudden divergence. And now you've still got some more degenerate Picts, but the really monstrous guys are a completely separate group. And that's the Lovecraft influence being absorbed by Howard through his own lens for his own needs.
At what point did Robert E. Howard read Arthur Machen himself?
I have an essay on this, Conan and the Little People. He did read some of Machen's stories in the 20s. I think it was like 25. But
we don't know for sure. We know he had read him by 1928, but when he discovered them, we don't know.
Yeah,
because he mentions Machen in a story called The Little People from 1928. So obviously he had read that, but we don't know when he discovered the tales.
There was a big Machen boom in the United States in the 1920s. Knopf did a reprint of a lot of Machen's early weird fiction, and Vincent Starrett did a 1-volume collection of Machen's fiction. And there's a good reason to believe that Howard read that book, because it has all of the stories that he would reference. If you're ever interested in pursuing this, I've got an essay online called Conan and the Little People. Just, Google that, you'll find it.
Fantastic. Thank you.
And then he also brought in the Ottoman Turks come in and witnessing what was going on at the village at one of their festivals and killing them all to eradicate them from the face of the earth. And I thought that was also a very nice touch on his part on adding that in as he was starting to write his historical stories roughly about that. Well, a little bit. Yeah, I guess it would probably be a little bit after that with the magic carpet and that's forerunner that Farnsworth Wright came up with.
I like that he brought it back around, and there's a reason they did that. And it wasn't just, the conquering people destroying the locals after they beat them. There was a reason that they did put everything to the fire, the sword in the fire, I guess. So I thought that was pretty neat, actually.
Yeah, and this is a rare story where Howard has an actual magic sword in it, because, the Muslims that go to fight this thing in a cave have steel blessed by Muhammad. They've got swords that literally have a holy blessing on them to go fight this thing. It's a great thing. it hints at a story that was never written.
And then for people who don't know, the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society, they do their own adaptations as radio plays of the 1930s and 40s of Howard Lovecraft stories. And a couple of years ago, they did an adaptation of The Black Stone that you can buy online at their website. Have any of you gentlemen had a chance to listen to that yet?
Yeah, I listened to it once. They do a good job.
Yeah, it's it's basically in the style of a 1930s radio drama. They change it up a little bit where they have sort of like the hard-boiled, down on his luck, lost generation American there in Europe who gets hired by sort of a Caspar Gutman kind of guy to go look to get von Juntz's book, and then they go in search of the Black Mound with the Strigoi and meet up with a Polish woman who's fighting the or maybe she was a communist fighting the fascists there. That it's a very entertaining radio drama. And I believe it won the award, or the Howard Award for I can't was it I think it was the Costigan Award that it won back in that year that it came out. Anything else we want to talk about on the Black Stone?
I feel like I got to offer a little bit of a hot take on this.
Okay.
The Black Stone is not one of my favorite Howard stories. It's a good story, but I can't help but think it's somewhat overrated. It's basically just a simple incident. And the one scene of horror, the unholy rite that takes place is the centerpiece of the story, and from whence basically all the impact of the story is drawn. It's a ghastly scene, and it's going to be remembered. I mean, they dash an infant against the stone, the grotesque flagellation scene that just goes on. It builds to a closing twist, which is basically, this was really scary. Who knows what other scary things might, lurk in the dark places of the world. So the climax of the end of the story seems sort of soft compared to what's come before. It's not as if it's a bad story. It's a good story, and it's certainly memorable. But you guys know this is the only piece of work by Robert E. Howard that's been included in the Library of America. Those acid-free bound black volumes with everybody from Hawthorne, Poe, Lincoln. And this one shows up in Library of America's American Fantastic Tales, Volume 1. It seems to me that Pigeons from Hell should have been there instead, but that's just me.
Well, there were some interesting choices in those volumes.
Mm-hmm.
Pigeons from Hell, I think, would have made a better choice. And I'm not sure those volumes are still in print. Actually, I hear they're hard to get.
Yeah, that one the first one I know is out of print.
Yeah,
I've contacted the Library of America about trying to get a Howard volume out, and they never got back or responded to any of that.
They did Lovecraft, so that's kind of shocking. So
I made a video urging them to include Howard, but for some reason, I guess they just never saw it. It's unbelievable, but I guess they just never did.
Such negligence.
All right. Now let's move on to the horror from the Mound. And I guess really the start of Howard blowing open the door on the weird Western genre. Any thoughts just off the top of your heads on the horror from the Mound?
These are the kind of Westerns he should have been writing, John, not the ones that you like that we talk about. These are the ones he should have been doing. So that's my comment. Go ahead.
Well, it's just that Breckinridge Elkins would have kicked the vampire's ass without any problem. So.
Yeah, it would only be 2 pages.
That's what we needed. Breckinridge Elkins and the Horror of the Mound. Yeah, that was it.
Some of the other pulp writers of Weird Tales hated this story just because it was such. August Roulette in particular was bitching in one letter to, I think it was Hugh B. Cave, that whoever heard of somebody going rough and tumble with a vampire? And the thing is, Dracula had already come out many, many years before and had basically established vampire lore for a generation or 3. But they always forget that, at the end of the story, you've got this big Texan driving a Bowie knife into the guy's heart.
Yep.
So, there's nothing really weird about a Texas cowpuncher wrestling with a vampire. But these guys really took offense to the idea that there wasn't like a sedate staking and beheading.
Hooey.
A
Hooey.
sedate
they were-
staking and
How
beheading.
dare Howard come up with an original idea? That's pretty damn
That's
horny.
it.
How dare he?
Yeah.
Well, I hope he doesn't
How
mess
dare
around
you
with
be
werewolves
original?
then. Jeez.
I was going to
How
say
dare
that.
you be original? Yeah, it's we have a formula, we stick to it, and everything that deviates from that is non-acceptable.
I was going to say that's when that god awful Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula came out. I took a couple of friends to go see it who had never read the book, and when they see the character of I forget the Texan's name and everything, it's like, was there really a Texan in that?
Yeah, Quincy Morris, right?
Quincy, that's right, Quincy Morrison. So, I was going to say that I did not know about the legend of the Irish vampire Abertoch, but I found out about it when it became popular a few years ago, where people were saying, "Oh, when Bram Stoker was looking at writing Dracula, that he did not look at Vlad Tepes, he was looking at Abertoch." Do you people know about Abertoch?
I don't.
Okay. Abertoch, according to Irish legend, was, I guess it would be sort of a midget, very mean, evil person who became the chief of a clan in Northern Ireland. And according to the legend, he was able to do that because he made a pact with evil spirits, much like Dracula is said to have done in the book. And that he had married one of the local girls there, and he thought that she was stepping out on him. So he went out he kept her, I guess, in his castle tower. So he went out, creeping up to go look through her window to see if she was having an affair with somebody, and he fell. Or she pushed him as she saw somebody looking through her window. He fell and died. So they buried him in the Irish chieftain tradition at that point of standing upright in the ground. That night he came back and he demanded they give him blood from them to keep him alive. So this happened for a while. His clan went and asked another clan hero, I think his name was Cathane, to come and help save them from this Abertoch coming back. So Cathane comes over, and that night when Abertoch comes back, Cathane kills him. They rebury him in the standard position standing up. That night, Abertoch comes back wanting more blood. So they call Cathane back, and I don't know how many times it happens, for that Cathane keeps killing him, and he keeps coming back that same night asking for more blood. So Cathane asks a holy man, depending on who's telling it, it's either a druid or a Christian, and the holy man says you have to make a sword out of the wood from a yew tree, pierce his heart with the sword, and then bury him upside down. And the interesting part that I've found on this, besides, the character of the vampire Don Santiago being intimated to learn sorcery that helps keep his life by becoming a vampire, is that in order to keep Abertoch down, they had to place, several thorny ash tree branches or whatever over the top of the grave. And then they would put a huge rock over the top of the grave, and he would not be able to get out because he could not move the rock. And in writing The Horror from the Mound, you have the vampire Don Santiago, in order to have him show up as a villain for the hero Steve Brill, because Hammer movies hadn't done their Dracula series where you have all the interesting ways of bringing Dracula back from the dead. But they didn't kill him because they felt they wouldn't, they would wake him up as they came upon him sleeping off, killing off and feasting on one of the members of the group. They buried him in the Indian mound in a stone-lined burial chamber, which kept him for those several hundred years until Steve Brill starts digging up the mound and dislodges one of the rocks. And as Steve Brill has dislodged one of the rocks, it's getting dark, so he needs to go get a lantern. So he goes and gets a lantern and comes back and looks inside, and the chamber's empty because the vampires escaped from the rock being dislodged. We know that Howard at that time was yeah, roughly about that time, was into his researching his Irish roots. Plus, we also don't know what his grandmother might have told him and Irish legends. Do y'all think that there's a possibility he might have known about the Abertalk legend when he wrote this?
I don't think so, because it never shows up anywhere else. It's very interesting to compare this story to the Cairn on the Headland, because in both cases you've got an ancient evil that's under a mound. It's basically the sealed evil in a can trope for Howard. And he doesn't use it very often, but he uses it in these two instances. And the funny thing is that Steve Brill doesn't use a crucifix to fight the vampire. In the Cairn on the Headland, he does, but in here, he doesn't. And these stories were probably written fairly close together. There's a draft for the Cairn on the Mound where the name of that character's partner is actually Lopez. And in the Horror on the Mound, the Mexican's name is Lopez. Could that be coincidence, or was he, reusing an idea and doing it a different way? We don't know. But no, I don't think that Howard was going off of any Irish vampire legend. I think he was riffing off Dracula a bit, because we know he had read Dracula, but he wasn't giving the vampire in the Horror in the Mound all these powers. He doesn't turn into a bat. He doesn't turn into a wolf. He doesn't have control over animals. He doesn't turn into mist. All the things that we think of from comic books and movies. He's just this strong undead guy with a thirst for blood, and eventually he kills him again.
And going off again from Dracula, much like that episode in the Dracula book of The Voyage of the Demeter, where the Hernando de Estrada, they are sailing to the Americas, and they find the ship that Don Santiago's on is the only passenger left, because he said all of the other passengers caught the plague and he had to throw their bodies overboard. So you have that element coming in from Dracula on that. What do y'all think about, in general, Howard starting? Because I think the Horror from the Mound was really his first major weird Western, and then he wrote several tales after that in the weird Western genre. How do y'all think that he had an influence on that?
Can you say that again, John? At the end?
Sure. What effect
Just
do you
the
think? What effect do you think his writing of his weird Western tales had on the genre and opening up to other people?
I wouldn't know.
All right, let me say this much at least. Okay, so the way Howard uses setting and characterization in this story is very different from how you would see many other weird tailors using this. Like when E. Hoffman Price wrote a story about a Spanish vampire in California, it doesn't read like somebody that knows the setting, because E. Hoffman Price was from California, but you don't get that impression of a regular guy just going about his life and suddenly there's a vampire. Steve Brill is absolutely not some heroic protagonist. He's an asshole. He's a racist. It's kind of funny because you see how racist Brill is in his thoughts and actions, and Lopez is just, basically a decent guy trying to do the right thing. It's a very atypical depiction of a Mexican character at the time in the 1930s, and everything starts because Brill is a racist prick, which is very atypical for weird tales and strange tales at the time. You just don't see that in the pulp as much, where the guy is basically a regular schlub who's also a jerk, but he doesn't get a comeuppance. It's the Mexican that dies, it's the white guy that lives. But I don't think that had a huge influence on weird Westerns, because it took a while for weird Westerns to catch on. And when it did catch on in the US, it was mostly through movies and TV shows, and it was very much the black hat, white hat gunslinger, cowpuncher sort of thing, and there's a vampire. The worst example is probably Billy the Kid meets Dracula, but there was also, I think, Black Noon in the 1960s. There were a couple examples, but it took a while for the aesthetic to catch up with the horror lore. Sorry.
Yeah, but one thing to be said is that Joe Lansdale became a writer because of his story.
Yeah,
he said that's the reason why I became a writer, because of the horror from the Mound.
Right on. That's a great little story, man. It's tight as a drum. It's just a really neat, quick array of events, one after the other. It pulls you in, draws you right to the end. It's a propulsive little narrative with a ripping Robert E. Howard conclusion. I mean, it's a satisfying little story.
Oh, it's excellent, I think. I mean, the way it twists the Victorian vampire and turns it into something American. A year later, he would be doing what with fantasy when he created Conan, just getting away from the European tropes and adapt that to his own context. I mean, that's what he did. He could not work from old paradigms. He had to create his own, and he Americanized the vampire in this story.
And as a horror story, it's just really solid. It's a solid little weird vampire story that's good. Again, for a story in Weird Tales, it must have seemed fantastic. And
well, not for, he got a lot of flack from it from this guy Olson in the Pages of Weird Tales. I don't know if any familiar with that. But there was the guy who wrote to the Erie, and he was lamenting about the story in which Mr. Howard had violated no less than 6 or 7 of the accepted vampire rules. I mean,
I can't imagine the average Weird Tales reader would be too worried about that. But that was a Robert E. Howard thing, wasn't it, though? He would take these traditional monsters, and he, just like he did in Wolfshead, and he would do his own thing with them. And
nerds are always going to be nerds. There's always going to be that one in the crowd, right? G.P. Olson of Sheldon, Iowa, was a guy that wrote into a lot of pulp magazines in the late 20s, early 30s. And he was very interested in physics and vampires and reincarnation. And he had some very strange ideas, and he'd write these rambling, bizarre letters to pulp writers, care of Weird Tales. And the general idea was that he probably was suffering from like tertiary neurosyphilis. And, you know, they hoped somebody had got him into a home or something when he finally stopped sending the letters. But we don't know. We haven't been able to identify the guy. I've got an essay on that in Weird Tailors if anybody's really bored.
Remember one letter that that he wrote it to Clyde Smith, where he was saying that he got another letter from that fool Olson, where Olson was saying that Jesus was a vampire. So
yeah.
So this is about my favorite horror story by Howard. But one of the things when I was rereading this that jumped out, and I think we talked in the Conan sometimes, that, you know, Conan, who was a smart barbarian, we've talked about that, but, you know, he sort of made deductive steps or observed things. And one that jumped out here was Brill says, you know, he held up his lantern investigating, and this is after he's found the dead body. The corral was empty. Not even the placid cow was in sight, and the bars were down. That pointed to human agency, and the affair took on a newly sinister aspect. Someone did not intend that Brill should ride to Coyote Wells that night. It meant that the murderer intended making his getaway and wanted a good start on the law. He's completely missed it here. I mean, he's making steps to analyze what's going on, but that's not what happened, and it wasn't human aspect, and nobody was trying to make a getaway. So it's the opposite of somebody the hero analyzing what's going on from that deductive or that perceptive state and moving forward in the story. He makes a completely wrong deduction, but moves forward in the story.
And clearly it was a vampire, so...
One thing that's really important about this story is that Howard doesn't use a lot of vampires in his fiction, Like Seabury Quinn, when he's writing the Jules the Grand Inn story, there's about 10 vampires throughout the whole series. But they're all pretty much the same. You know, they're all following the Dracula rules. They're all doing the same thing. When Howard uses vampires, they're all different. The vampire in the Horror of the Mound is not the vampire Akivasha in the Hour of the Dragon, and she's not the vampires in the Hills of the Dead. So Howard was always one that was taking a familiar idea and putting his own twist on it. And I think that works better because you're not expecting them to follow the same rules. You know that it's going to be different every time.
I was going to say, as part of that, the difference between one of his horror stories and one of Lovecraft's stories is, of course, Lovecraft's people are driven insane or die, and in his stories, the protagonists fight off the evil and generally survive. And so here we had the story where Steve Brill is able to fight the vampire off and break its back and leave it in a burning cabin as he runs away. So you have his little twist on that. So I thought that was interesting also.
One thing we haven't mentioned yet is the influence of the Icelandic legend of Greti the Strong. And there was an article about this written by Jeff Shanks and Mark Finn, I think, where it shows that clearly the pattern of the story is after this Icelandic legend, right to the end when he kills it by breaking its back, and there's a fire at the end, if memory serves.
Yeah.
He transplanted to Texas.
Yeah.
And that's the important part, because if you look at Howard's weird westerns or the weird southwestern stories, it is very much a sense of place that comes through. Like that start at the beginning of the Horror of the Mound where Brill's talking about all the things that happened to his farm. That could have come straight out of one of his letters to Lovecraft, talking about the droughts and the insects eating all the crops. And, you know, the guy ends up at the end of the planting season no better off than when he started, and maybe a little worse. And, you know, that translates very well because it feels authentic.
Absolutely.
And you get a lot of that. You get a lot of that in like old Garfield's Heart too.
Yeah, same. All the stories he wrote after that, all the weird ones after Horror from the Mound, give or take, or have this authenticity to them. I mean, if we're talking about Wolfshead earlier, I mean, there's no way you can believe in the Africa of Wolfshead because it was so far removed from him. It was not even attempting to recreate an Africa. Same goes with Shadows. But beginning with that, I mean, he was telling that to Lovecraft, if memory serves, in a letter. It was, I've been trying to infuse my native region. I forget the exact quote, but with some sense of, I don't know, Texas or something. I forget the exact wording of it. But it was very clearly a move on his part. He was trying to do that. And as Bobby said, which is why the tale reads authentic. You believe in Steve Brill being the poor jerk tenant farmer, racist, whatever. It's a believable tale.
Yeah. I believe that letter was to Carl Jacobi, where he was asking and saying, you know, what did you think about old Garfield's Heart? And where he was saying that, I think he said that one of the things he said was people were telling him, like Lovecraft and others were telling him, he should start talking and writing about Texas, and that he was having a problem with that because one of the things he said was because he knows so much about Texas history and people and land that could cause him problems in writing the stories with a Texas basis to it. But
yeah, it actually comes from a letter to Lovecraft from April 1932. I'm trying to invest my native regions with spectral atmosphere etched against a realistic setting. The Horror from the Mound is the current weird tales, yada yada.
Okay.
And Lovecraft was trying to push Howard to being sort of a regional writer like Derleth was with the Sack Prairie Saga. But like Black Canaan started out as Kelly the Conjure Man, a story that Howard had written to Lovecraft in a letter, and Lovecraft was encouraging him to write this. And other writers in Howard's circle were also encouraging to write more about Texas. But Weird Tales was his big market. So that's how you get that sort of confluence of, okay, he wants you to write more about Texas, but you need to sell this story. Let's make it a weird one.
And I think it was roughly around this time where he did have sort of a burst of writing weird Western tales about Texas, because you had The Horror from the Mound, Old Garfield's Heart, The Man on the Ground, and then about a year or so later, finishing up with The Dead Remember.
Yeah, those stories, with the exception of The Horror from the Mound, all the stories you just mentioned were written around June 1933. And that's when Howard took on Otis Klein as his agent. The common point with all those stories is that part Western, part weird stories, which is typical of Bob Howard, because in case this failed to sell to Weird Tales, he could still market it to a Western magazine. So it was more of a marketing thing here than something that was, I want to write about my own region.
Interesting. We have anything else we want to say about The Horror from the Mound? All right. Let's move on then to what most people consider to be his best horror story, Pigeons from Hell. Who would like to start off on this?
What a ripping opening this one has. I mean, you are right there immediately, and he doesn't have to tell you how scary it is. He doesn't have to use the word fear 6 times. He doesn't have to tell you, oh, it's a horror. You are right there in the dark with the narrator. So it's a great start to a horror story, and it doesn't really let up from there.
For me, this is his most, just as a pure horror story, this is his most successful, I think. Just coming at it from as a horror story.
Right. Do you remember, try to think back the first time you read it and the first time you saw the guy coming down the stairs with his cleft skull.
Yeah.
I mean, I get the chills the first time I read that, and I don't, you read it again and it can get you the same way, I think. This one's great.
Yeah, I was going to say it had been several years since I last read it, so I was rereading it for this video. As like you were saying, there were parts of it where I was like, oh, this is just fantastic writing. It's putting chills on me reading this various parts from this story. So
this was a very unusual horror story for Howard. He had written plantation horror stories before. He had that sense of the old dark house, but the addition of the sheriff gives it a deductive detective element that he very rarely puts into his horror fiction. And that it works in a way you wouldn't think it would work. A lot of horror writers at the time were using the detective story as sort of a blueprint for how they would let the mystery unfold. But in this case, Howard actually makes it function within the setting in a very realistic way. You don't have this super detective character come along. You don't have a plotting policeman. It's just a very authentic, careful, methodical guy that knows the area, and he's not willing to discount anything out of hand.
Do you think?
What I think is, go ahead.
No, I was going to ask you, okay. Patrice, is.
What I like about this, I like many things about this story. One of the most fascinating aspects of it is its origins. As I guess everybody here knows, we first find the story in a letter that Bob sent to Lovecraft around October 1930, alongside with the story of Kelly, the Conjure Man, that would be the basis for Black Canaan, both tales, which he only wrote 4 years later in 1934. So he sends that, and he says, yes, those horror stories, they crept me out when I was a kid. They just frightened me. And then the reply of Lovecraft is, well, New England is the place for horror. There's nothing that can equal New England. And then Bob goes, yes, you're absolutely right. Even though in his previous letter, he was telling him, Lovecraft, that, well, those stories frighten him. He said, you're absolutely correct. Then Lovecraft proceeds to send him the Nameless City, which, the one with the paragraph at the beginning, which goes about New England and Providence being the whatever. So he agrees with Lovecraft in October 1930, saying, you're right. New England is a place for horror. I mean, it's, Dunwich, it's Innsmouth, etc., etc. And he doesn't write those tales, even though as a person, as a kid, and as a writer, those were the tales that had impressed him so much when he was little. Flash forward 4 years later, he writes, in quick succession, Black Canaan and Pigeons from Hell. And Brian Leno has demonstrated, I don't know if you have read his article on Pigeons from Hell. For me, it's a masterpiece because he says, well, Pigeons from Hell is a horror story for sure, but it's also an attack against Lovecraft. Take a look at the titles of the chapters. There's The Whistler in the Dark, and there's The Call of the Zuvambi, riffs on The Whisper in the Dark and The Call of Cthulhu. So he's poking fun at Lovecraft. The two guys of the story who arrive and the one who died, they come from New England. So it's clearly, the article is called Lovecraft's Southern Vacation. And it's clearly Lovecraft who decides to go somewhere in the Arclatex section of the States, because we don't really know where the story takes place. And they discover the old plantation house, and that's where he dies, even though for someone from New England is a geographical center of horror, but they discover that such is not the case. And then we have Buckner, the sheriff. He's a Texas guy. He's Howard in a way. And he does not believe in the supernatural per se, but when confronted with it, he said, okay, yeah, such thing can exist. And then he deals with it in a pragmatic way, if you will. So it's clearly, for me, Howard telling Lovecraft, well, fuck you. We have horror here. My region is also a region of horror.
Yeah, I was going to read the saying or the passage that is his direct middle finger to Lovecraft. That the character Griswold says, "Voodoo," he muttered. "I'd forgotten about that. I never could think of black magic in connection with the South. To me, witchcraft was always associated with old crooked streets and waterfront towns, overhung by gabled roofs that were old when they were hanging witches in Salem. Dark, musty alleys where black cats and other things might steal at night. Witchcraft always meant the old towns of New England to me, but all this is more terrible than any New England legend. These somber pines, old deserted houses, plantations, mysterious black people, old tales of madness and horror. God, what frightful ancient terrors there are in this continent fools call young." Can't read my writing.
Yeah.
You can pretty much see
clearly take that, Lovecraft.
You can see the two characters as being, I mean, Buckner is pretty clearly like a pragmatic, down-to-earth, Robert E. Howard style character. Again, he confronted by the supernatural, he identifies a threat and reaches for his 6-shooter. Whereas Griswold, the New England guy, he's the Lovecraftian character. He passes out. He runs away. He loses control of himself repeatedly. So yeah, I hadn't seen how clearly Howard is sort of refuting Lovecraft pretty much across the board here, but there it is.
And this wasn't the only time. In the Challenge from Beyond, the round robin story where Lovecraft and Howard both participate, Howard's section follows Lovecraft. And Lovecraft had the protagonist transposed into the body of an alien worm, and he's horrified. And then Howard gets the section, and he's like, all right, so I'm a worm. I'll conquer the world. And, it's a wonderful juxtaposition of their styles and approaches. And Lovecraft, he thought it was hilarious. I don't see this as a middle finger to Lovecraft as much as a response to Lovecraft that, they were friends for all their differences of opinion. And I think this was definitely Howard working something out, but not necessarily in a mean way. That's just
I
me.
don't see them as friends, especially from 1933 onwards. When you read the letter, there's a lot of angst, and you can see all the stories that Bob wrote after 1933, the major ones, I mean, they contain points, elements that are taken from their exchanges, and the story is in many ways an answer to those points, a fictional answer, obviously. I think I was making this comment in the earlier podcast we had, John, about the Conan stories, but you find those elements in Vultures of Wahpeton, in Almeric, in Pigeons, obviously, which is the most flagrant. Uh, they creep up everywhere. So I think there was a lot of resentment against Lovecraft.
It
I
might
mean,
well
even
be.
in the letters, you would see, oh, sorry, last time I lambasted you, Mr. Lovecraft, but I was, under the sway of one of them black moods. Easy.
Well, Lovecraft thought they were friends. Let's put it that way. Whether or not Howard had some resentment that he was working out, yeah, probably. But Lovecraft thought they were friends, and he didn't take any offense from it.
Yeah, he wrote that he did love their letters where they were sparring with each other in the letters about all their various arguments they had. I was going to say,
back to,
on his writing of the Black Stone, and as you brought up earlier about the sheriff coming in as the sort of like the detective person, do you think that his attempts to break into the hard-boiled mystery market influenced his writing of the Black Stone? Because he also wrote several weird menace stories that would kind of read a little bit like.
Well, the thing is, Pigeon from Hell was published in Weird Tales, but only in the May 1938 issue. That's 2 years after his death. The reason for that is Pigeon from Hell was not sent to Weird Tales. It was sent to one of those Weird Menace pulp magazines, crazy as it seems, because those were bad pulps, most of them. And here we have this masterpiece, and it was just a throwaway story that was sent to Otis Klein.
Wow.
Was this sent, do you think, to those other magazines because Weird Tales wasn't paying him at the time? Because there was that issue.
Could be. But I mean, I don't know, honestly, but the fact that he sent that to Klein just tells us that he didn't think it was a masterpiece, it was just, a story like any others. I don't know where it went on the top of my head. I need to look this up.
Yeah, well, Patrice
It was sent to, oh yeah. So Klein received that on December the 10th, 1934. It was sent to Miller, which was the agent for Klein. And then the next trace we had is 1937, sent to Weird Tales.
I was going to say, for folks who don't know, what Howard, when he got or took Klein on as his agent, their agreement between them was that Howard, for all of the pulp people that are editors that he had created on his own before he hired Otis Klein, he would send the stuff to those people, and then any other new stuff to any new types of pulps, Otis Klein would send that stuff. So the fact that he did not send this to Weird Tales shows that Howard did not send this to Weird Tales, that he sent it to Otis Klein, tells you that he didn't think that he was gonna, or he did not want to send it to Weird Tales for whatever reason. So
Farnsworth Wright, the editor of Weird Tales, wasn't squeamish, but he got a shock in the early 20s when an issue of Weird Tales might have been banned in Indiana. That's sort of complicated. But whenever he got a really gruesome Weird Tale, he was very sketchy about actually accepting it. So that might have gone into Howard's thinking if he thought that Pigeons from Hell was too extreme with some of the things it depicted or hinted at. I mean, you do have a gory hatchet murder, corpse coming down the stairs. You do have the hints that Aunt Cecilia is mixed race. You do have her transformation into a Zuvembi, which we really need to talk about. So it might have thought that this was too much for Weird Tales. But the terror pulps, the shudder pulps, like Dime Mystery, that was their bread and butter, was, stuff that was too nasty for the other pulp magazines to publish. So maybe he did think it had more of a chance at like Dime Terror or something.
Why do you think it didn't sell? I mean, even to a lesser pulp, but Howard's name being what it was by that point in the game.
I don't think it's a case of not selling. If the file we have is complete, what it says, they got the story and then they did nothing with it for whatever reason. Usually we have the distribution circuit, really, if you will, and it was sent to such and such pulp magazine, sent back, sent to this other one. Here we have nothing. So maybe there's stuff we don't have. I don't know. Maybe it was from the file of Miller. So Miller may have had files of his own, but we don't have those.
Well, let's go into the. Yes, Bob, do you have something else?
I'm just saying it.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry, wrong Bob.
Other Bob.
Bob and Bobby.
There were very few outlets for fantastic fiction in the mid-30s. After Strange Tales of Mystery and Terror goes away, there wasn't really another pulp on the market that covered the same range as Weird Tales did. So if you're not sending it to Weird Tales, where are you sending it to? And, there's some of the Shudder pulps and there's some of the sci-fi pulps where it obviously doesn't fit. And I think they just ran out of places they could really get it to fit into. And that's why it sat for so long.
Do you have something, Bob?
I was just going to ask, I've never watched the 1961 suspense version of this. I'd totally forgotten about it, actually, and I know it's online. I was looking at that. I mean, it's there, so I'm going to after we're done with our thing. But
it's thriller.
How
not
was
suspense.
that? Does it adapt well? Did they go off into left field? Or
it's arguably, I think it's the best adaptation of Howard to film thus far.
Excellent. All right.
Yeah.
So it's on the web, folks. You can find that. It's on.
Go YouTube, and it's actually Thriller is the TV show.
Oh,
and
did I
it's
say suspense? Sorry.
Yeah, you said suspense. It's Thriller. Pigeons from Hell. Going into the sources for Pigeons from Hell, we know from what Patrice said on the letter that Howard wrote to Lovecraft, where they were talking about spooky stuff, that he mentioned that when they were living in the East Texas town of Bagwell, they had a black woman named Aunt Mary Bohannon that Howard heard several stories from her about the legends among black people about horrible things, spooky things. And so she told him the story that she said sort of like was their urban legend of black folks who are traveling around the South and who would come upon old deserted plantation houses, and that whenever they would go to the house around sunset, that invariably they'd see a flock of pigeons fly away from the house, and that they would go inside the house and to sleep, and that there would be usually it was a headless giant who would come walking down the stairs, and bad things would happen to them.
It usually does when a headless giant comes down the stairs.
And that his grandmother also would tell him stories of horrible, terrible things that would happen. Bobby, you mentioned about the Zuvembi, and that would tie into Howard's correspondence with Henry S. Whitehead. So do you want to talk about that?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say Whitehead, but in the 1929, William Seabrook published The Magic Island. The U.S. had been occupying Haiti and the Dominican Republic for a period. So all this voodoo lore suddenly came into the popular culture with the publication of The Magic Island and then its unofficial film sequel, The White Zombie. So people knew about zombies. People had this idea about the living dead, the walking dead. But Howard took it a step further. He made the Zuvembi, which was something completely original to him, because he read about Seabrook, but he didn't read the Magic Island, as far as I know. And he wanted something different. And that's what he got, because Weird Tales was sort of flooded with stories about Seabrook-style zombies. If you read August or Less, The House of the Magnolias, that's very much a Seabrook-style zombie. And Howard wanted something new and original, and that's what he put together, was the Zuvembi, which is really his own way of making something his own. He didn't want to just follow the established lore with anything. And that has an odd legacy, because in the 1950s, when the Comics Code Authority came into effect and censored American comic books, you couldn't have zombies in comic books for a couple of decades. So what Marvel Comics did was they started to refer to these things as Zuvembis, not zombies. Very different spelling, completely different idea. Even though, eventually the Comics Code Authority lost its steam and you got Marvel zombie comics and everything. But, Howard has his weird little pop culture influences like that.
Yeah, that's how I first heard the word Zuvembi, was Marvel Comics. Yeah, old Marvel Comics. This is such a Pigeons from Hell, regardless of how it was conceived. It's a powerful horror story. It's just, as a story, it's great. I remember the first time I got a Zebra paperback was the first time I saw this story, and I think it was titled, if I'm remembering right, I have it somewhere, where it says Pigeons from Hell. I think it had dinosaurs on the cover.
Yes.
Yeah, Tooth Jones dinosaurs.
And so it was a collection of these stories, and I saw the title Pigeons from Hell. I just thought that's hilarious. What kind of crazy title is that? But when I got to the story, I genuinely found it frightening from the first paragraph on. That whole opening scene was just really scary. And I remember thinking, just, wow, this guy is good. This guy is really, really good. It was one of the earlier Robert E. Howard books that I had read, and I was suitably impressed by this story. And it's always been an impressive story to me. Every time I read it, I just think it's great.
Yeah, you really have to be American not to be frightened by such a title. I live in Paris, and pigeons are from hell. They are everywhere here, and you want to avoid them at all costs.
So I see Joe Lansdale did the Dark Horse comic. I didn't know that was Lansdale for Pigeons from Hell.
There is a beautiful adaptation of the story by Scott Hampton that came out maybe 40 years ago. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
No.
It's a beautiful graphic novel. There was also a follow-up to the story, kind of a follow-up. It was not a follow-up. It was weird, written by Joe Lansdale, which was real bad.
Yeah.
And while you were talking, guys, I did some checking on Black Canaan, which was written just before Pigeons from Hell. Same story. The story was not sent to Weird Tales, but to Otis Klein. So there was something going on there. I don't know what.
Yeah. Well, maybe, does it say on the Otis Klein sheet when they received the story from Howard?
Oh, yeah, sure. You want me to check that for you?
Yeah, because
but October, which one?
Either one.
Both.
Give me 1 second.
Because my thinking would be if it's in late 1930.
Black Canaan was received on September 17th, 1934, and Pigeons on December 10th, 1934.
My thinking would be maybe by that time, Howard, because he was being owed so much from Weird Tales that they haven't paid him for the stories they had published at that point, that he just said, "To heck with them. I'll just send this to somebody else." Because
could be, but could also be that he had just sold the Iron Dragon to Weird Tales, so he knew that the following year would be full of Conan.
Yeah.
So there would be no slots for him.
While we're talking about Pigeons from Hell, there was another plantation sort of horror story, The Shadow of the Beast, which
is a horror, yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely,
which preceded it. It's very much sort of like in the Forest of Villefere versus Wolfshead. If you read these two back to back, you can definitely see how Howard was taking some ideas and then developing them further and in different directions in the second story. Yeah. But he had that idea of the plantation horrors that, how do I put this? It was the era of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, where they were trying to play down the horrors of slavery in the American public consciousness. But Howard had heard stories. And even though he was all very gung-ho for the Confederacy and the South, he wanted some of that to work its way into the psychology of his Southwestern horror stories. It's sort of not just the backdrop, but it's sort of the bones of the story. You always have that racial divide, that history of racially motivated violence that underlies the character interactions whenever you see it in Shadow of the Beast, Pigeons from Hell, Black Canaan. You can't ignore it. And he makes sure you can't ignore it. And that's sort of what makes it so strong, even when, there's not a lot of black people in the story, as in Pigeons from Hell. There's only one actual black character in the story, and that's the old guy that's telling you a little bit more about everything, and he gets bitten by the snake. But everybody else is just background characters that you hear about.
I was going to say, going into that in that letter to Lovecraft, where he was talking about Mary Bohannon, that she used to be a slave, and he told a story where she said that the missus of the plantation, Mrs. Bohannon, was a very cruel mistress, and that she would regularly whip the slaves. And you have that with the character of Miss Celia in the story, where she would whip the mulatto slave girl Joan, and got Joan so angry at her that Joan went to Jacob to get the medicine to turn Miss Celia into the Zuvimbi. So, and also another thing, showing that he wrote the story to play with H.P. Lovecraft, is he had the year that the youngest of the sisters, the Blastonville sisters, Elizabeth, ran and fled from the plantation, was 1890, Lovecraft's year of birth. So, and he says that a couple of times in the story. So,
yeah.
Let's see. Anything else y'all can think of on talking about Pigeons from Hell?
This is a pretty extreme revenge story because, she wins. She turns her into a zombie and leaves, and then ends up, all the sisters end up dead. The one sister escaped, I guess, too. This is a pretty intense revenge story, I think. I mean, that kind of came out when I finished reading it. I was just thinking, wow, that was,
It's dark and it's very Southern Gothic. I mean, when you think about it, you've got the old house with a secret room of murder where the corpses are still hanging after all these years. And that's very Castle of Otranto-ish, Not that Howard was very hugely well-read in the Gothics, but it's got some of those tropes that come through very strongly.
Yeah. Anything else we could think of to say about Pigeons from Hell?
Yeah, I was reading some of my notes on that, and there's a story that was published in Weird Tales in 1923 called Weaving Shadows. So you may or may not have read that story, but I'm taking my notes and translating at the same time. So excuse me for a second. It's a detective story about a guy who sleeps in a haunted house with a sister and her niece, and there's weird stuff happening at night. because there's two guys sleeping in the house. One of them dies. There are dead women who walk at night, footprints, and a woman who was murdered many years prior, and a secret room. So it was, in my note, troubling, but I haven't reread that in years. It's in Weird Tales. 1 second. I need to find the exact issue. You can find that online, at archive.org.
Yeah.
Where am I? I think I've 1 second.
Yeah.
I am lost within all my tabs. Oh, that's it. Weird Tales, March 1923, the first issue.
Another thing that just struck me off,
which also has Ooze by Rudd, which also foreshadows Lovecraft. Funny enough.
Yeah. I was thinking another thing that just struck me that might possibly have been an influence on the tale was, as Bobby mentioned, Howard loved Ambrose Bierce and his stories, and he's got that famous ghost story about, I think it's the middle toe of the right foot.
Yeah.
For spoilers for people who haven't read it, is basically a guy kills his family and leaves, and he comes back and he gets challenged to a duel with another guy, and they go to the house where he lived. Nobody knows he's the guy that did that. So they're getting in there at nighttime to fight, and they get into a room and the lights go out and spooky stuff happens and everybody flees except for the guy, and they find him the next day in daylight on the room, dying. I can't remember. I think he died from fright or possibly got stabbed by the ghost. But you see it was his wife and two children. And I think the wife was missing the toe on one of her feet. I think it was the right foot. So you see these footprints walking up to him, 3 sets of footprints, the two children, and then the larger of an adult with the missing toe and the footprints going up. So you have sort of that playing with the footprints and upstairs happening, and Pigeons from Hell. So that's a possibility, but who knows?
Is it a child or is it a native from the island of Tonga? We may have to look into that.
So I think we're pretty much done for what we were planning on doing today. Gentlemen, have anything you want to talk about in general about these 5 stories we looked at from Howard?
Yeah. I want to point out we didn't hold this up at all. I mean, I don't think we're allowed to have a panel without holding up the Del Rey, but I can barely see it in there. But all the stories that we talked about today are in the Del Rey that we're constantly promoting is awesome. So,
yeah. Like all of those stories except
I've even got this, which
ooh.
Oh, it's floating around. But almost all of these are in the Del Rey as well. Not quite, but.
Yeah. This is the hardcover from, I think it was Subterranean Press.
Nice.
Very nice.
Which comes with the incredibly bright slipcase.
All right, then. Thank you, gentlemen, for appearing today and talking on this.
Thank you.
We are planning our second part where we're each going to be picking 1 or 2 of our favorite horror stories from Robert E. Howard, not necessarily from the horror stories of Robert E. Howard Del Rey book that we will be discussing the next time. We will hopefully be able to see everybody back for that.
I want to point out how well behaved this group is when you take Finn out of the thing. It speaks for itself, but and I'm sure we'll see that act out again. But
well, Mark is irrepressible, so what can you say?
Unstoppable. Yes.
All right, then, gentlemen.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you again, and we will see everybody soon.